Welcome to EB5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shah, and other attorneys at Mona Shah Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB5 Investment Voice.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mona, and ready to talk about regional centers.
So, Mark, as you know, we've been going through all of the older regional centers and getting their viewpoints, often related to their experiences, and it's been really interesting and different. Today, we do have another one of the first regional centers, and I always categorize them in batches because when we first put up NYCRC back in 2006, 2007, at that time, there were 24 regional centers. The first 24 I class as the real oldie goldies, and then you have the next, and then suddenly we have the mushrooming of regional centers. So in the first 24, one of the first ones of the first 24, Mark, is one of my favorite ones, which is EB5 Capital. And do you know why that's one of my favorite ones?
It's one of the oldest?
No, try again. It's one of the first ones with a lady, a female at the head.
See, I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, that's Angel Brunner's regional center, but she's not with us today. Today we have Brian Ostar. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Mona. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for coming on the show.
Sure. Happy to be here from Washington, D.C.
Oh, so far away from New York.
Right.
And Atlanta, where I'm at. Well, let me go ahead and introduce the listeners to Brian Ostar. Brian is the Senior Vice President of Global Operations at EB5 Capital, as we mentioned, based in Washington, D.C. There, Brian is responsible for all global fundraising efforts for the firm's projects while managing the investor relations and marketing communications teams. And that makes him the ideal guest to talk to on today's episode. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark.
So, Brian, as you heard, I was just talking about EB5 Capital being one of the oldest regional centers. What brought you into the EB5 industry?
So I was living in China in a city called Hangzhou in 2008. I was working for a consulting firm, and we had a contract with the large oil and gas company in China called Sinopec. And some of the senior managers asked us in a meeting how they could immigrate to the United States with their family. Back in 2008, EB5 was just a drop on the radar, and not many people have heard about it. So our company created a side business for EB5 in China. And I was one of the first Americans on the ground living in China to do EB5.
Wow. And then you met Angel, and then you decided to join EB5 Capital. And the rest is history.
That's right. We joined IUSA. So we were one of the first, 15 or 20 members of IUSA.
Yeah.
Peter Joseph was running that still with Steve Allure. And then when I moved back to New York, actually, in 2010, I hooked up with Angel and joined her firm.
I believe at that time you had one of the first ski projects which was out. I don't know if it was at the same time as JP came out, but it was definitely one up in Vermont, as I recall.
That's right. So that was before my time. So Angel did that. That was her very first project, Sugar Bush Ski Resort. That was interesting because that was a troubled business model where the jobs were being preserved as opposed to created. And to this day, I haven't seen too many troubled business models. So it was quite interesting for her to do that 10 years ago.
Certainly, and certainly not one which have not only got everybody their permanent green cards, but repaid. Because Sugarbush was one of the first ones which had repaid all their capital to their investors.
That's right. There were 40 investors from a pretty wide variety of countries. Now, what's funny about that is back in 2008, we secured maybe one or two investors per month, which was, cause for celebration in 2007, 2008. it would be a pretty slow raise nowadays, but back then it was good.
Yeah. And also, when you go back in that time as well, the projects were pretty bad. I think the standard of the projects recently or within the last 3 or 4 years have increased dramatically, don't you say?
They have.
I mean, increased in standard is what I meant.
Sure. Now there's just under 1,000 regional centers, and a lot of big names have come to the game, and that drives competition, and competition usually raises standards.
As well as you mentioned, there's probably not a lot of these distressed or troubled businesses like Sugar Bush. That's certainly an outlier out there. Well, Brian, let me ask you this. Since EB5 Capital is one of the oldest regional centers, how important do you think it is in today's market to have experience? You have experience, and you mentioned there's about 1,000 regional centers out there that may not have as much. How important do you think that experience is?
It's very important. It has been important. It is important. It will be important. Our investors, they find us either through their agents, through their attorneys, sometimes on their own. What draws them to us is our track record. So we typically talk about our regional center, our track record, our history of repayment, our history of 829 approvals before we even talk about what project we might have available at that time. Right now, our projects sell out in 3 or 4 months. So when an investor talks to us, it makes sense that they focus on what we've done in the past so that when they're ready to invest, we'll just show them whatever we have is available.
Brian, that might be for you, but I have often advocated for newer regional centers and newer projects by saying that, it doesn't really matter what experience you have in the EB5 industry as long as you have experience in, say, the industry you're going into, whether it's real estate or something else. And bear in mind, there's been a number of lawsuits against the older regional centers. Sometimes having age doesn't always help.
That's definitely true. I would say, though, that EB5, as you know, Mona, is a pretty specialized industry. It's a complex industry. A lot of people have jumped into it thinking that it's easy, and it's not.
Right. Yeah, well, that's true.
So just having experience in real estate or whatever industry you're investing in my opinion, is maybe half the battle. Some older regional centers have been caught up in some negative stories, whether it's fraud, which you can commit fraud whether you're old or new, or poor choice of project, poor choice of location, poor choice of developer. Now, when a regional center does 20, 30, 40, 50 projects, just like any business, you're bound to run into a problem here or there. So that's not to be unexpected.
Well, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And as I say to my investor clients, that it really doesn't matter about the last 10 projects. What matters is the project you're going into. And if you're really not sure and you're going into the regional center because you trust their opinion, that's one thing, but you should still look at the project.
That's right. Well, we say it's about half-half, right? So you have to find a good attorney, right? You have to find a good advisor or consultant or an agent, of course. So you have to have a team around you that will help you. And then you have to find a regional center that you trust and that you like and that has a track record of success. And then, of course, you have to choose a project that fits you and fits your needs. We've done everything from hotels to senior housing to apartments to mixed use and, of course, to a ski resort that we talked about earlier. And we have clients from 54 different countries right now. So different investors from different regions of the world will be attracted to different types of projects.
That's very true. You just mentioned, though, that you need an agent. Now, many of our listeners are not coming through agents and they're interested themselves and they come directly. And I would say that we as a law firm as well have an awful lot of direct clients. You don't have to have an agent at all. In fact, sometimes an agent is not what you need.
That's right. I had said an agent or an advisor or consultant. Usually, even if you do not have an agent, you have some semblance of support around you. But sometimes an investor is confident enough to contact an attorney directly, contact a regional center directly. And that's certainly been done many times.
Right. And we have a lot of developer listeners, Brian. They would be interested as well to know, because some of their projects, and they bring their projects to us, are really, really good. But we do not necessarily advocate that they should go out and put their own regional center up. We think that sometimes, and especially in today's market, they're better off either renting a regional center or finding a regional center like yours who would pick them up.
I would agree. Many times a developer might try it on their own. And if they're successful, there might be cost savings for them. But like I said earlier, EB5 is a very complicated business. And more often than not, a developer doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have the network, doesn't have the experience to go out and raise 40, 50, 60 million dollars overseas.
Oh, usually they have no idea, and they come to us for ideas. And that's when I think the red flags for me go up at that point. I think, do you know what you're doing? Because if you're not going to enter into this industry or go and get a project if you have zero idea on how to even get investors.
That's right.
What's your opinion of the independent nature of regional centers like yourselves versus the developer regional centers, though?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a question that comes up a lot at different conferences and different panels. We, of course, are an independent regional center. We do not develop our own projects. We do not own our own projects. So we find comfort in the fact that we only represent the investors. And a lot of the earlier regional centers were structured like this. The old guard of regional centers were all independent regional centers for the most part. Some were not. Lately, a lot of developers have done it themselves. I can tell you, Mona, that there have been a lot of times across our past portfolio of projects. We are up to number 25. So the past 24 projects, there have been lots of cases where we were able to do something or say something or stop something to protect the investor where we might not have if we were in control of the project. There's a number of examples just to put some stories behind it. But one such example, there was an older project we did in an apartment building in Washington, D.C., and the developer was looking for a construction loan. And as an EB5 partnership, we like the loan, the senior loan, to be coterminous with EB5. So whether it's 5 years or 3 to 5 years, some kind of short-term construction loan so that when there's an exit for the senior loan, there's an exit for EB5. Some projects and some very good projects are able to get what's called a construction perm, which is not a permanent loan. It's not a 20-year loan. It's not a 3-year construction loan, but it's some kind of 10-year construction loan, which is great. It's great for the project. It's great for the bank. It locks in your interest rate. And we have the right in our documents, among other rights, to say no to that, which is what we did. Because we did not want to put our investors in a deal where the first possible capital event might be in 10 years.
Oh, wow. But that's happening more and more now. We are seeing that in documents.
You mean 10 years?
Yeah. Well, what we're seeing in documents is the fact that an investor may not get his money back for up to 10 years and will be getting increased interest after a certain period, which allows that for that provision.
So that may be a new phenomenon due to retrogression.
Yeah.
The Chinese wait time, of course. I'm sure you've covered this in other podcasts, but it's quite long. No one knows how long it actually is, but many people are saying it's over 10 years at least. So if you're a regional center that has relied on China in the past and still relies on China, and even places like Vietnam now will be in retrogression for a short period of time. India might be very soon or in the next couple of years. So longer term loans do make sense when you're focused on countries that can't get their money back in 5 years anyway.
Yes, but a lot of our listeners are not from countries like that. And even India, we're expecting retrogression by next year, by the way, 2020.
In India?
Yeah, because with the numbers, it could happen at the end of this year, but that's what the numbers have been. And we'll know more when Charlie comes up with his wonderful figures later on, Charlie Oppenheim from the State Department, later on this month. So we'll know more then. But a lot of people really are still under that whole thing that 5 years, it's a 5-year loan, I'm going to get my money back after 5 years, after I get my green card. There are still a number of projects out there which can match that expectation.
Yeah, we still do 5-year terms. So we have 5-year terms. We have 2 1-year extensions. Our past projects that have been returned have been all under 5 years. We just had one that's 4 years. Now, for the investors that are not eligible to get repaid, we have to redeploy those funds. But we haven't seen a need to move past 5 years. And I think it's similar to what you just said, Mona, in that our investors come from such a wide array of countries that we can't do any one change that might push aside a quarter of the world.
That's right. Well, there have been changes, though, which have come out of less business coming from China. And I think one of these is that we are seeing is the huge discrepancy in interest rates. Because there's still a number of projects which are giving 0.025% or 0.5%, and then now suddenly we've got projects which are giving 2 to 3 to 4% to the investors, that is, rather than to the agent.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Because in the olden days, I think the expensive agents that we had from China, the money would go there. But I know EB5 Capital didn't go towards those type of agents.
No, we. I don't know if you want to call it some good foresight by Angel back in the early days, but we were never committed to being dependent on one country, regardless of what that country was, whether it was Korea, even before China. We always felt as a company, our philosophy was to be as expansive as possible so that if one area dried up, we would still survive. So fortunately, we followed through with that. And that's why the China hit hasn't hurt us like it's hurt some others. Our project size also comes into play. So our average size across our past deals is probably 50 or 60 investors, which is
relatively small.
Yeah. In comparison, at least the past 3 or 4 years, it's pretty small. It's good in that we did not have to rely on any 1 or 2 large expensive agents. The fact that it's small, we're able to fill up a project relatively quickly, like I said, in a few months, which is attractive for a developer. Last thing a developer wants is to sign up a regional center and not know when the money's coming in. That impacts their senior loan, it impacts their closing date. So we felt like the sweet spot for E5 was in that range.
Well, Brian, let's explore interest rates a little bit. What impacts interest rates and how are those affected? I know Mona said before that some interest rates have been, really low, almost 0%, maybe a 0.25%, and some over 2%. We've talked about agents and things, but I would really love to hear from you and your experience as one of the oldest regional centers. What impacts interest rates?
Sure, Mark. There's a few things to consider, and actually a few different numbers to consider. You have the rate that you pay the investor. And we've always been in the 0.5 point to 1 point ballgame. Then there is a rate that you might pay to an agent, if there is an agent involved. And then you have to charge the developer a certain rate. Now, we've always been of the mindset that we cannot ask or charge too high of a rate, because once we are in the same level as traditional capital, then EB5 becomes pointless.
Agreed.
Our deals are almost always in the second position as preferred equity or a mezz loan. The rate for that money in traditional capital markets could be anywhere from 10 to 15%. So if we're anywhere near 9, 10%, developers are just going to go that route. EB5 is a headache. It's difficult. A lot of regional centers end up not raising any money. They'd rather just work with a firm that has the money set aside already.
Well, that's a good thing for developers and investors to keep in mind, because EB5, as you mentioned, it can be a headache. We've done over 50 episodes on this, and Mona's firm has done a tremendous amount of work in the EB5 space. There's more than just the investment involved. There's the immigration case, which presents its own headaches. And if you start charging a rate such that for the developer, it's the same as, a mezzanine loan or preferred equity, that they're going to go that route, as well as if you have to pay the investor so much that it drives that up. Same thing holds true. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Well, also, if I'm able to charge a developer 10% for preferred equity and they say yes,
I would run away from that project then.
they have no other access to capital.
Yes, exactly,
right?
Exactly.
That's a risky, yeah.
So we try to, we've always tried to be in the 6%, 7% range, which allows for a little bit to the investor, a little bit to the agent. It's able to pay us to keep us profitable, and everyone wins. And that's our philosophy.
So when you see a project now jumping up and giving a much higher interest rate, what does that indicate to you?
To me, it could be a number of red flags. It could mean the regional center has to offer more to an investor because they have no other access to investors. It could mean the project is offering a higher rate because they have no other access to capital. My philosophy has always been that the better projects will get the cheaper capital, and the better regional centers will be able to offer lower rates because there's enough demand out there to fill those spots. We wouldn't offer 4% to investor if we could get the same number of investors at 1%. That's just a bad business decision.
So lack of experience or lack of options on either the development side or for the regional center side, either one of those could honestly create more risk for the investors. So that's what to look for, the red flag. You see something too good to be true, it may be too good to be true.
Yeah, the one caveat I would say is if you're doing a real equity project, and there's a number of regional centers that do them, and good for them, and they're able to offer their investors higher returns, and the investors are actually in the equity component of the project.
But now, usually there's a caveat, yes.
Yeah, there's not a very clear exit, right? If
right.
you go up 100% of the project cost in the equity group, you're not getting out until 10 years when they
do a liquidation event. Yeah, and as you mentioned, most of the projects you work with, smaller projects, fill up 3-4 months. You get that return in 5 years, maybe even less than some if they're able to do that. And you've got perhaps a couple of 1-year extensions if need be, but never. Sounds like it never goes beyond 7 years.
Has not for us yet. It hasn't gone past 5 years for us.
No, not 5 years. Okay, so you offer the 1-year extension, but you haven't had to do that in the 24, 25 projects you've done to date?
We offer it to the developer. The developer has not exercised them yet.
Wow, okay.
No, that's a good point. Brian, I did want to mention the fact that you guys are all over the place. You did state earlier that you have a variety of EB5 investor markets. Do you want to quickly tell us?
Sure. We have 54 countries now
wow.
among all of our partnerships. And we've built up a very strong investor relation team here in our DC office with native speakers from those countries that manage those markets for us. We obviously have staff from China, India, Korea, Vietnam. We also have staff from Russia, from Brazil, from Venezuela, from Nigeria even. Our colleague just went to Nigeria on a trip, and we're starting to make some inroads there.
54 countries, Brian, is really impressive. But I think that's really where we are going to see EB5 going, the rest of the world. Because without China, I think we do have to focus on the rest of the world. And it's a pretty large world out there. Brian Ostar, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me.
Thank you for being with us today on EB5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shah Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB5 Investment Voice.